Hi everybody! In this video we're going to look at two more biogeochemical cycles. We're going to look at the phosphorus and water cycles. The water cycle is also called the hydrologic cycle in environmental science. And similar to the carbon and nitrogen cycles, you don't actually need to draw a diagram of them while you watch this video. We'll end up doing that in class when I see you next. So phosphorus is an important element for living things. It's a major component of our DNA and RNA, so nucleic acids in living things, as well as ATP, which is the molecule that holds our cellular energy. Similar to nitrogen, phosphorus is also a limiting nutrient, so it's commonly added to fertilizers, but it's limiting in the environment. So if plants don't have enough phosphorus, they won't be able to survive and grow. Different than the carbon and nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle has no gaseous phase. So that means phosphorus is never converted into a form that's going to be found in the atmosphere. And that's one reason why it's a limiting nutrient, because it's really difficult, or it takes a much longer time to move phosphorus into the water from the land. So it can't just dissolve in there from the atmosphere. The only time that phosphorus is found in the atmosphere is when dust that contains phosphorus is dissolved in rainwater. So that usually is pretty rare. It doesn't usually happen. But because we don't have a gas phase, phosphorus isn't moved readily from one place to another, which causes it to be a limiting nutrient. Phosphorus is typically found in the form of phosphate, which is PO4 3-. And there are 5 processes that drive this cycle. They are assimilation, mineralization, sedimentation, geological uplift, and weathering. So the abiotic processes of the phosphorus cycle are sedimentation, geological uplift, and weathering. So these first kind of 3 points here are abiotic. And these involve the movement of phosphorus from or between water and land. So the first thing to note is that phosphate, which is the form that phosphorus is usually found in, again, that's PO4 3-. Phosphate is not very soluble, so that means it won't stay dissolved in water. Instead, it'll precipitate out and become a phosphate-based sediment. So basically, when we're thinking about phosphorus, we're thinking about kind of this test tube on the right. It may begin as sediments floating around in water, but over time it'll just precipitate to the bottom and kind of settle here, and it will be sediments. And the largest reservoir for phosphorus is sedimentary rock, which is formed by high pressures due to water overlying these sediments. Those high pressures compress the sediments and form sedimentary rock. So tectonic activity causes geological uplift, which moves oceanic rock layers up to become mountains. So this takes millions of years, but basically if we look at this diagram at the bottom, we have these sediments right here, phosphate sediments. They settle at the bottom of our body of water, and all this pressure pushes down on these sediments, forming sedimentary rock. Over time, as tectonic plates move, so if one tectonic plate is moving this way, another one might be moving this way, and over time as they come together, one will subduct underneath the other, and the other will be pressed up, and that's when we get mountains formed. These are really bad mountains, but that's when we get mountains forming. And then once we have this phosphate-based rock that is in the form of mountains, the rocks containing phosphate are weathered, which occurs due to rainfall, other natural forces just wearing away at the rock surface. But this brings phosphorus back to terrestrial and aquatic habitats. So that's when we see rainfall, weathering these phosphates, they return back into aquatic environments, become sediments, and then settle at the bottom of these bodies of water again. Okay, so then our biotic processes are assimilation and mineralization. So these are biotic, so they occur with living things. So plants and animals will take in phosphate from their environment as they take water in, and they'll assimilate that phosphorus into their tissues, so it'll become a part of their tissues. It'll be used for making DNA and ATP. But then when organisms die, they're decomposed by fungi and bacteria again, which releases that phosphorus back into the environment. And then through a process called mineralization, it's converted back to phosphate. So basically with organic materials, so living things, we have PO4 3 minus. This is organic phosphorus. So it's converted to phosphorus in plant and animal bodies. So we have assimilation on one side, and then we have mineralization on the other side, which basically converts phosphorus back into phosphate. So there are several human impacts on the phosphorus cycle. First off, phosphorus-containing rocks are mined to produce fertilizer. So that's the primary reservoir of phosphorus is in these sedimentary rocks, and those sedimentary rocks are mined and used to collect that phosphorus to add into fertilizers. Fertilizers artificially introduce phosphorus into terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. This is due to leaching and runoff. So when you apply fertilizers to an area, when it rains or when you water that land, some of that phosphate is going to be carried away by the rainwater and moved into other terrestrial areas or into aquatic ecosystems. And then detergents, laundry detergents also introduce or increase phosphorus levels. From the 1940s to the 1990s, laundry detergents contained phosphates. But since this caused so much environmental and economic damage, manufacturers stopped adding phosphates into their detergents, and it's actually banned in many states now. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient, so when we get extra input of phosphorus from fertilizers or from laundry discharge, that can lead to algal blooms. So algae can grow much faster than other plants. They're not rooted, they're single-celled, so they can rapidly reproduce when they have lots of nutrients available. So when that happens, some algae can actually produce toxins which can harm people, they can harm pets, they can harm wildlife, and it can also cause eutrophication, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But even around Sonoma County, when we can see sometimes beaches or lakes are closed, and that's because there is algae present. The algae that's of concern is called cyanobacteria, and that can produce toxins. And so people can become sick and pets can become sick as well. So it's important that you adhere to these signs when you see. So eutrophication is a process that we will investigate a lot more in a later unit, but we're just going to introduce it today. So basically, when nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus enter a body of water, they are limiting nutrients. So when there's a lot of them in a place where there generally weren't too many of them, that allows plant life and algae to grow. Algae will grow much more rapidly than plants because they are single-celled. They can reproduce really quickly. So they grow really rapidly, and this results in an algal bloom. So if we're looking at this diagram, I'll show it to you again in a later unit, but we have farms over here, and when you add fertilizers that contain phosphorus and nitrogen to your farmland to support your crops, some of them are leached from that soil and fertilizer and carried in water after it rains, or if you water your field really heavily, it can run off into nearby aquatic ecosystems. So then this is where we see an algal bloom occurring. The algae will grow really rapidly. They'll gain a huge population, basically, and then after a period of time, they'll start to decompose. So as those algae decompose, decomposers, which are generally bacteria, will use up a large amount of oxygen in order to break down that dead organic material. So bacteria break down algae. They use lots of O2, which causes oxygen levels to drop. And this is called hypoxia. And this creates a dead zone. So it's called a dead zone because just like in a terrestrial biome and an aquatic biome, organisms require oxygen. So if there's not enough oxygen because it's been overused because these bacteria are trying to break down lots and lots of algae, other organisms like fish that require fairly large amounts of oxygen will suffocate and will die, or if it's a slow enough process, they may just move to a different area if that's possible. However, if you're trapped in like a lake or pond, then those organisms will just die. And so that's why these are called dead zones. So this is something that's negative, a negative human impact that occurs when we use fertilizers. The last biogeochemical cycle that we're going to discuss is the water cycle. This is also called the hydrologic cycle. Water is essential for life. It makes up over half of a typical mammal's body weight. So for us, we are made up of a lot of water. It's really important. Water does cycle through the biosphere in both, liquid, solid, and gaseous phases. So unlike the phosphorus cycle, this does have an atmospheric component, and these transformations are powered by energy from the sun. So the largest reservoir of water is definitely oceans, and then the second largest, but it's much smaller than the oceans obviously, is our polar ice caps and glaciers. So the processes that occur in the hydrologic cycle are evaporation, condensation, precipitation, transpiration, runoff, and infiltration. These first three, I'm guessing you're familiar with. These are really powered by the sun. So one of the other three processes of the water cycle is called transpiration. This is when plants release water from their leaves into the atmosphere. This happens during photosynthesis. This process, coupled with evaporation, is called evapotranspiration. So you can refer to transpiration and evaporation separately, or you can refer to them together as evapotranspiration. So in this process, plants will take up water through their roots, and it's then drawn up through their stems and moved towards their leaves. The plant leaves have pores called stomata, and this is where gas exchange occurs. So CO2 is taken in, oxygen and water is released through these pores, and transpiration is just the release of that water through these stomata into the atmosphere. Stomata are located on the underside of plant leaves. This is to reduce any extra evaporation that could occur if they were on the upper top surface of leaves. More water than is ideal could be evaporated through these stomata because of the exposure to heat and solar energy. But basically in these diagrams on the left side, this top one is an actual microscopic image of a stomata. So we've got two cells on the outside. These are called guard cells, which you don't need to know. But those guard cells take in water, and when they swell, they open up the stomata. So if you look at this diagram on the bottom, these guard cells will take in water and they'll expand, causing this stomata to open, and then they'll release water in order to close. And in general, stomata are closed during the nighttime. The last two processes in the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle are infiltration and runoff. And these occur when water falls back to the earth in the form of precipitation. It can take one of these two routes. It can either infiltrate into the ground or it can run off into another body of water. So infiltration is when water is absorbed by the soil and that water percolates down into the groundwater. And that just means it moves throughout the soil, through cracks in the soil into the groundwater. And groundwater is just water that's trapped underground in cracks. It's trapped between spaces in the soil or in sand or rock underground. Infiltration happens when water comes into contact with porous or permeable soils and rock or permeable surfaces. So if you just have an area that is made up of soil on the top, it's more likely to infiltrate. That water is more likely to infiltrate and percolate downwards. Runoff is what occurs when water moves across the land surface into streams and rivers or lakes. It can move into lakes, standing water areas as well. But this occurs when water falls on an impermeable surface. So infiltration happens when a surface is permeable. Runoff happens when a surface is impermeable. And runoff has increased over the years as humans continue to build cities and urban areas. We add in more impermeable surfaces like roads, sidewalks, and buildings, which leads to more water running off and less water infiltrating, which means our groundwater levels have been slowly lowering over time. So there are a lot of human impacts on the hydrologic cycle. The first one is by harvesting trees, that reduces the amount of evapotranspiration, which leads to more runoff or more infiltration. It can also lead to erosions and flooding. So when you have fewer plants, that means less plants are actually able to absorb the water through their roots, take it into their tissues, use what's needed, and then release water back out through their stomata. But also, when you harvest trees are super important for ecosystems because they help to hold the soil in place because of their root systems. So when you are absorbing less water by roots, more water is infiltrating into the ground, and also fewer roots are holding that soil in place. So if that soil becomes really waterlogged, that's when we can get erosion, we can get mudslides happening, and other negative impacts from actually harvesting those trees and taking away that kind of water storage area. So also urban development reduces percolation or infiltration, which reduces runoff and evaporation, or which increases runoff and evaporation, sorry. So as we add more impermeable surfaces, that means more water is going to run off or evaporate. So we have less water that's actually moving into our groundwater areas, meaning there's less water for us to use for drinking water, less water to pump up, and less water for just underground in general. Also, humans divert water. They divert streams and rivers for drinking, for irrigation, and industrial uses. We also have things like dams where we kind of block off these waterways and create new standing water areas. So these are all ways that we impact the hydrologic cycle. Your practice FRQ for this section, the first one is focused on the phosphorus cycle. So you're going to look at this top diagram, and the second, part B, is going to focus on the water cycle, and you'll be looking at the diagram underneath.